We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
So, hello everyone, welcome to the first panel titled Developing a Multi-Domain Approach and the New Spaces of Confrontation. My name is Émile Lambert-Deslandes, and it is an honor for me to moderate this panel of experts. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University and coordinator in the Strategic Analysis Network, and a person who has been sending you a lot of emails over the last few weeks to organize this symposium. Without further ado, let's start with technological proliferation, exploitation of new spaces, and multidimensional threats. The purpose of this panel is to really explore the implications of these new threats for Canada and its people and its position in the world. To discuss this, we have an impressive panel of speakers. We have with us Gaëlle, Rivard, Piché, who is a strategic analyst for Defense Research and Development Canada, where she works closely with the Canadian Armed Forces. As a defense scientist, her research work directly supports the decision-making process of the armed forces. Ms. Richard Piché is a Norman Paterson School of International Pars at Carleton University, where she also completed her PhD in 2017. She's also a guest lecturer at and consultant at the Canadian Forces College for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on the issues of security reform and peace operations. Major General Gregory Smith is Director General at the International Security Policy in the Department of National Defense. He has served in every battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment, including at the platoon and company level. He was the commanding officer of the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, command of the command police of the Staff College, and served as director of the Infantry Corps. And he was National Military Representative and Formation Commander in Europe for Canada and Deputy Chief of Staff at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe in Belgium. He also served at the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command. Professor Stephanie Martel is an assistant professor of political studies, specializing in international relations at Queen's University and at the Center for Independent Policy, and the distinguished scholars at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. She serves Canada within the group of eminent persons and experts at the NAS Regional Forum. Her research focuses on multilateral diplomacy, security, regionalism, and the role of discourse in the practice of international relations, particularly in the context of Southeast Asia. She's also the author of the book Security Hacking Community, Never to Science, a Never-Ending Story, which I believe was published this year. And to finish up, this group had already been introduced, but I'm going to reintroduce them. Professor Justin Massy is a professor of political science, full professor of political science at the University of Montréal, Université du Québec at Montréal, and co-director of the Strategic Analysis Network, and was a Fulbright chair of the Canada-US relations at Johns Hopkins University. His research focuses on multinational military intervention, global power transition, diplomacy, and Canadian foreign and defense policy. His work has been published in journals such as the Journal for, numerous journals on strategic culture of Canada. How will each panel work? At the beginning, each panelist will give a short presentation on the general theme of the panel, then we will move into a period where I will ask questions, and it will end with questions from the audience. Over to you, Ms. Gaëlle Barbichette. Thank you very much for the invitation, Émile, and for organizing this panel and symposium, and also to Stephanie and Justin. Thank you very much for everything that the Strategic Analysis Network has done. I think it's extremely interesting to have moved from the academic world to the government world. This type of initiative is extremely important, and the more we can collaborate together, I think the more we can take away from this, both from the academic and government sectors. Before I begin, I would like to point out something in the same vein as Stephanie. In fact, it's very funny. Stephanie and I did our undergraduate degrees together, so you never know who you'll be sitting with on a panel. In fact, in our your first international studies course in Montreal in 2005, and now we're on a panel. So before I start, I just wanted to sort of point out that, as usual, my remarks today do not represent the official position of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Department of Defense, or the Government of Canada, but is certainly informed by research work I do in my current position as a strategic analyst for RDC, which is embedded within the Canadian Special Operations Forces. These days, most of my efforts go on Arctic defense security questions and the role of the Canadian Armed Forces, especially Special Forces, and the future operations sector. Now I'll switch over to English because despite the fact I'm bilingual and that French is my first language, I can tell you that I'm increasingly unilingual in English on security issues. So, Jean-Christophe, I do understand.
So I think it's pretty clear. This is what we discussed last year. I think the panel this morning really emphasized that. And I have to say, I would love to be commenting on everything you discussed. I agreed on so much on what Roland and Carrie pointed out. But Canada's threat environment is growing more and more complex. And yes, there's the notion of those new domains of operations. I would point out they're not battlefields. We have to be very precise about the type of the terminology we're using, the concept we're using, and especially in an environment, in an information environment that's evolving very quickly. So I think we have to be both as analysts in government, but also as academics, we have to be very careful about the terms we're using and how we're defining them, first of all. But I'd say that in the operating environment is compounded both by the technological development that are affecting the conventional domains. So when we talk about domains, we're talking about conventional domains, land domain, air domain, as well as the maritime domain. But new domains of operation, or what I call the virtual ones. So cyber, but also information, and even the cognitive space or the cognitive domain have all have either emerged or have gained a lot in importance. When I talk about the cognitive domain, it's not new. Just think about like winning hearts and minds in Afghanistan, psychological operations, and so on. That's what we were talking about, right? It was the information environment. It was a cognitive domain, but it's really the advancement in technology, and I would say like the democratization of technology that have made those environments even more important. But all of that for Canada has meant that our country, geographic sanctuary, are what made us feel safe at home for probably since the end of the Second World War has really been eroding. And so we're facing more threats. And I think threats are not only from, I would say, a military perspective or intelligence perspective, where we have access to a threat picture, but also for the general population. And we've seen CSC, so the community, the Canadian Security Establishment, and CSIS come out actually publicly raising concerns about foreign threats to Canada. And to me, this is really interesting because it's not something we've seen a lot, I would say, and it's really emergent. It has really emerged in the last few years. Also, as Carrie Buck pointed out, a lot of the threats to Canada are not military in nature and actually do not require a military response. There might be a role for the military in responding to those threats, and especially in a supporting role, but overall, it's mostly a civilian response to those threats. And so when we're talking about non-military threats, we're talking about foreign interference, espionage, economic threats that go from access to sensitive technology, critical infrastructure, stealing of sensitive personal data, all through, and that can be used either through information or cyber domains. The other thing I want to highlight when we talk about like this complex security environment that require like a multi-domain or a pan-domain approach is the fact that there's less and less distinction between foreign and domestic. What happens abroad has clear implications for what's happening home, and that has been made possible or has been amplified by both the information domain and the cyber domain. So when we think about, that's a conversation I had last week in another workshop, but we were talking about the role of diasporas, right? Countries or regions that were not necessarily of like highly strategic importance to Canada before are becoming like their issues are becoming more and more important at home because the diasporas are have a bigger voice, but also the information circulates faster between the community in Canada and their family members or their community back home. And another point I want to highlight is this distinction between war and peace and the use of the term warfare. I think we need to move away from this. The famous threshold, whatever that threshold is, I don't think we know what it is. Like, it's pretty clear in a situation like Ukraine, whereas there's actually like an invasion, a conventional invasion. But I think we need to reframe the conversation, especially when we're talking about threats to Canada, about different levels of competition. We are in an environment where competition is becoming more and more acute, but it doesn't mean that we're at war. And so it's more about understanding what competition means and how Canada can position itself in that environment, more than debating whether this is peace, this is war, is it like hybrid warfare? Are we talking about below the threshold, gray zone conflict, and so on? All these concepts raise interesting intellectual conversations, but I think from an analytical perspective, and especially when we're talking with government and policy, we need to simplify things. And I would say even when we're talking to Canadians as well. And so in that competition space, I think our adversaries are doing different things, but not everything, or I would say other states are doing different things, but not all their actions are necessarily going against Canadian interests. So it's about problematizing how other countries advancing their own interests is actually conflicting with Canada's interests. And this is what we need to focus on. And so from a Canadian perspective and from a perspective of threats to Canada, in that very, as I said, in this very complex environment, we need greater conceptual clarity to anticipate, detect, deter, and then counter those threats. And that means, as I said, that we need to clarify what is a threat and how it's affecting Canada, because if everything is a threat, nothing is a threat. And I have some issues saying and that's probably based on my own bias working for the Department of Defense and my own background, but I have issues when we talk about climate change as a threat. It is a challenge. It doesn't make it less important, but if we define threats as the result of an actor intent and capability, it is not a threat. However, it creates really important vulnerabilities in Canada that could be exploited by foreign actors. And that put us at greater risk of, and that creates security risks. And so in my work on Arctic security, I look at a little bit distinguishing vulnerability, risks, and threats. What are vulnerabilities? So they are susceptible factors that are increasing our susceptibility to harm. And I would argue that threats will manifest and explore the gaps and seams between those vulnerabilities. And so from a Canadian perspective, defending Canadian interests, whether it's sovereignty, territorial interest, or Canadian society, Canadian democracy, Canadian social integrity, goes by not only responding to threats, but to actually anticipate them by better understanding where vulnerabilities are and how they can actually be addressed, like way left of the bang, to use a military expression. So for example, and when I talk about threats actually exploiting those threats, like a good example of what it could look like, of the process that would be in place would be, for example, when we looked at the Canadian Arctic, Huawei Canada on its its main Canadian website is promoting the right to internet access for all Canadians across the country. In doing so, they are using the promotion of, they are leveraging Indigenous identity through pictures, through local businesses, and they are really targeting contentious Crown Indigenous relations, which when you put in perspective or in the context of how they're treating their own minorities at home, quite rich. But this is just to show you how our adversaries and other states are already targeting some of our key vulnerabilities. Historical, contentious relationship with northern populations, lack of technology, gaps in technology in the north, and also lack of economic development and the promotion of local alternative economic development processes. And so I think I'm going to stop here, but maybe the one thing I will say, and we can address this later, but in terms of solution, what does it mean? And I think it's about investing first of all in a joint picture and joint analysis of the kind of vulnerabilities we have in Canada. It's updating some of our policies, and it's also creating mechanisms where when we're looking at threats to Canada, it's not only the national security community that is actually concerned, but that disinformation also includes other departments and agencies, other levels of governments that are actually also involved in that process, not only in terms of identifying the vulnerabilities, but addressing them. And also, I would say the democratization within government of intelligence assessment, so that we can talk about those threats and we can have a more proactive approach throughout domains.
Thank you. It was not our conscious decision to create a reunion here with this panel, but it's great to see this. I think it's part of the RAS mission to network together and have a closely knit together network. Now I'll give the floor to Major General Smith. Okay, I will also be mostly speaking in English. But I would first like to thank you for this invitation. I think this is quite interesting. We'll speak in English. I see very few people with headsets. And so, obviously, many of us are able to speak in French. I also see in my workplace where two French speakers speak in English, and that's kind of shocking.
But that being said, again, thank you for the invitation. And just describe very quickly what you see before you, because I know we military weirdos don't always show up to things like this. I'm an Army officer. I've got about 32 years now in D&D in the Canadian Armed Forces. A lot of joint time more recently, which just means I haven't been doing Army stuff particularly. And right now I'm in this creature called Assistant Deputy Minister Policy. And what is policy? I'd call that decision-making. Political decision-making. And very clearly in a democracy, we expect properly elected officials to make the decisions. And we, the Canadian Armed Forces, can charge forward very quickly and get stuff done. In fact, it's one of our great strengths. And part of my job is just to remind my Canadian Armed Forces colleagues that, hey, we're not there yet. The minister decides that stuff, and she's very deliberate about saying, yes, you're authorized to deploy or to take certain action. So it's kind of my job. I got a great team that helps make sure that proper decision-making takes place, whether it's a memo or a memorandum to cabinet, whatever it is. I've got a fantastic group of people that do that. So that just gives you some perspective. And what I think I bring to this is not with my academic bona fides. I'm always trying to be less dumb, but I don't stand up very well with some of the people up here, but I will talk about my experiences and where I think it applies to some of this. And I would like just to say, just like the previous speaker, I am clearly apolitical. And if at any moment you go, wow, that's really dramatic and very outside of what I've heard, I am being apolitical. And if you challenge me and go, that's actually not what, okay, then that's my bad. I'll walk that back. I am here to represent policy, not kind of show you that. But that being said, I hope I give you some things to think about. I would suggest that we, from an informational and a cyber perspective, are under attack every day. And most of us, we don't get to see that, and that's wonderful because there are systems in place that protect us from us. Perhaps, and I realize it's a little bit sensitive right now talking about viruses, but probably like every day your body is protecting you and you don't even know it until something really bad happens. We've all experienced that. And I think there's probably an analogy both in the cyber and the informational world. But what is an information attack? And indeed, what is information? I'll just give you a perspective. In 2016, I spent about 10 months in Baghdad, deployed with the American forces, fighting against the Islamic State. And at that time, it was a highly kinetic operation. And I left just as the Iraqi army was smashing into East Mosul as they retook a city of 1 million people, like Ottawa. Not exactly the same infrastructure, but of a similar scale. And at one day, as I got back to my containerized housing unit, as they would call it, where I would sleep at night, I got a couple of desperate emails from my wife that said, oh my God, are you okay? I'm okay. I'm working horrible hours, but things are fine. Somehow in the information space, there had been attacks south of Baghdad at a kids' soccer game. And a large number of children and women, particularly, it was specifically women, had been killed. And that spun into the Western news. there were far bigger attacks, far more dramatic attacks happening every day in Iraq and obviously throughout the world. But that one made it to the news in Canada. Why? Women and children? I don't know. But that made it to the news in Canada specifically. So I just ask you to think, what are we exposed to for information? Outside of information attacks, etc., what we get is, I suppose, what news editors want us to see, what we want to see, what we expect to see in our news. And if it's a human interest story, or if it's something that you would particularly want to pick up and read, then you do. And if you don't, it's probably not going to make it to the news. So that's just a concept of every day we're undoubtedly being attacked, but every day we're only getting the information that I guess we want to see. And I'm not even an expert on what algorithms do and what you get via your different social media platforms. Equally, information and what we get and how would we protect ourselves against bad information, I would suggest gets very quickly political. So what is the truth? What is the right thing for us to understand and be exposed to? And whose job is it to say, no, that's wrong? There's a book somewhere that talks about the ministry of truth, and I think it was seen as a really bad thing for government to try to tell you what the truth is. And so I equally say within a democratic process or within democratic government, is it the government's job, I include myself in there, to tell you, and particularly on the military side, what the truth is or what information is right and what information is wrong? Just a question. I don't have the answer. It's a difficult one to think about. And I would say equally, democracies quite rightly are very uncomfortable with military involvement in a political debate, as they should be. We get essentially shut down for information before elections. The moment the writ is dropped, we stop talking. And that's quite right. You do not want the military involved or even being seen involved anyway in information around who should be elected, who's better on the military side, etc. There are governments in the world that do that. I've served with a Pakistani officer who said, Greg, the military shouldn't be involved in government because he'd been involved in a coup. He indeed was seconded into the Ministry of Agriculture and had absolutely no idea what to do there. And I can confirm I would equally, although I've worked as a farmhand years ago, I am not particularly good in agriculture. So again, I think quite rightly, just democracies are distinctly uncomfortable in dealing with information. And therefore, there are other arms of national security agencies, et cetera, that can look at how to deal with that and deal with the battle of narratives. And I use that term deliberately, and I'll tell you another quick story from Iraq. So there was a very active informational. I talked about it being a very kinetic fight, true. There was also a very informational battle going on in which the legitimate government of Iraq and the Islamic State were battling for the heart and soul, the heart and mind of the Iraqi people. And there was a horrific video put out on social media in which it showed an Iraqi officer yelling at somebody off screen, shooting somebody, and then dragging what looked to be a boy's body and throwing him under a tank, and the tank driving over him. So then the experts started looking at this and saying, okay, so there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, the badge isn't quite right on his uniform. Second of all, the accent is not Iraqi, and I don't speak Arabic, but they were like, these are the experts that would look at that. But this battle, this little unique engagement spun into social media, and it fights against the bigger narratives of who has legitimacy, who's protecting Shiite, who's protecting other aspects of Islam. And it just spins off and it adds to it. And there's that tactical battle that feeds up to the bigger strategic competition. So I'd suggest there is, again, some analogy to what we see every day in information. There are unique little battles that every day you get to watch on your favorite social media platform that feed into a bigger political debate or other as well. So where do I end with all this is I think defense for both information and cyber actually starts at home. It's societal. There's some really good examples, and I've served 3 years in NATO, of the Baltic countries in particular, that educate on both cyber and informational. They have a discussion about what is good cyber hygiene, what is good informational hygiene, which again, I think is a very difficult discussion to have, but it starts in school. You do it at home. And not to get all weird in front of you here, but like, so I'm a parent, successfully raised 2 children. You have a sex talk with your children and tell them, you know, here's what's going on out there and you got to be careful. And they're going to go like, I don't watch my child constantly, particularly because one's 21 and one's 19, and that'd be really creepy. but they're out doing whatever they're doing now. I've done what I can to educate them, to inoculate them against bad stuff happening, from my analogy of the sex talk. How do you do the same thing at home? This is bad information, or this is what you should, these are some filters you should think about as you get information to prevent radicalization in whatever sense that is. I equally can remember visiting my daughter in her room someday, and she already had a patch over her camera on her laptop. I didn't tell her to do that. It was obviously part of the hygiene that she had been exposed to with her friends. So I think I'm going to back it all up to say, number one, there is a battle on both information and cyber happening. And I don't think necessarily I'm the right guy to be sitting there fighting for you. There are agencies and others that can do it. But more particularly, I think I look back at all of you. You are part of the solution to this battle, because it starts at home, it starts at school, and that's where it can be done best. Thank you.
Thank you for those insightful remarks. I will then give the floor to Professor Martel.
Hello, thank you. I am absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak in French as well. So I have a slightly different logic from my colleagues. I don't have the opportunity very much to comment on Canadian foreign and defense policy in French, and particularly with a Indo-Pacific angle, which I will try to develop with you today. So I'm going to do it in French today, even though I will sometimes switch to English on a certain number of terms that are more familiar in the language of Shakespeare. And I'm also delighted to be so well surrounded today, because being approached for putting forward some thoughts on a panel that was interested in a multi-domain approach for Canada, I honestly expected to offer some thoughts that were a little bit out in left field, or a little bit different from the rest of the panelists, but I'm actually quite pleasantly surprised to see we have a lot of common ground to highlight together today. So that's great. I'm going to start by saying that it is often said that Canada needs to find a way to put words into action when it comes to foreign and defense policy. I'm going to focus my contribution today to highlight the importance of the words aspect that we tend to question a little bit, or that we need to question it a little bit more in depth. So the other panelists have done before me, I want to emphasize the importance of words and language as a strategic area that is taking on a new twist today, and is absolutely crucial when it comes to thinking about how Canada can find its way back onto the international stage in the Indo-Pacific region in particular. And it's absolutely crucial for Canada to find the right words before we can think about how they translate into action. And I think there's a gap that needs to be discussed. And it's rather unlikely that the exercise of not finding the right words or finding the right tone in the way we position ourselves in the regional space that is increasingly important will stop at the production of a possible Indo-Pacific strategy that we've been waiting and hoping for. But what would obviously be desirable that this strategy places Canada on the right path. So I would provide some food for thought on what it would mean to put Canada on the right path, and to find the right words and right tone within this Indo-Pacific strategy. We are in an era of new public diplomacy, so obviously the weight of words and language today in foreign policy and defense is becoming more and more important, and goes much further than the distinction that we regularly use when we talk about moving from words to actions, more than the distinction that we make between rhetoric and practice. And we realize that today the frontier between the two is very porous. And what we call rhetoric, or language of words, is a concrete, practical field of foreign policy and defense, and a ground on which there is a real confrontation on a strategic level. And the fact that today we are in an era of new public diplomacy also makes this confrontation, even if it takes place in spaces that are hidden from us, or where we cannot witness this confrontation, it is also played out in public spaces, on social media, a little bit everywhere, where all the corners of the international community have access to this war or battle of narratives, such as my co-analyst highlighted it. And there's a very important aspect of how we can characterize this battle of language, which is the mass information and disinformation. So situations, and it is underlined by the excellent report of the Strategic Analysis Network, that actors present alternative facts that are providing evidence as fabricated. Or even they don't need to provide evidence, which is a different story. And they have practices that are very concrete, have harmful effects, and result in the weakening of trust in our institutions that polarize our societies and radicalize certain groups, including within Canada, who have been quite harmful and have quite nauseating effects. And that's obviously a problem, but what we need to understand is there is another dimension, a more general dimension to this confrontation of stories or narratives. And we must recognize that it appeals to the existence of divergent positions on the very nature of the international order, on the principles on which international order is based, on the practices that have come from or resulted from this attempt on both sides to stabilize or destabilize this international order, rules on which the international order is based. And here, in fact, the line between what is true and false is much more blurred, because we are faced with positions which, even if they are presented as certainties by the actors who defend them, who are obviously interested in defending their positions, are in fact normative positions. And so Canada, in my opinion, must have a greater ability to distinguish clearly what is true and false, facts versus what is made up or invented, and what is fiction. And Canada needs to, in my opinion, put more energy into reflecting on the distinction between the two. Because I challenge you to find a single person who wishes to contribute to or even destabilize the international order, who is against or is positioning themselves very, very clearly against an international order that is free, open, and based on rules. And the reason for this is simple. To add to what my colleague Gaëlle said about conceptual clarity, it's a formulation which is extremely vague and which is subject to different interpretations which are available in the public space and which are conveyed by different actors in different states. So we can certainly say, as Canadians, we can disagree with a certain number of positions that are based on values with which we profoundly disagree. But that does not make this position wrong or objectively wrong, because we are talking about normative positions. We are talking about values. So it's important to make the distinction between the two. And that led me to look at and try to contribute to the discussion that we continue to have on a possible Indo-Pacific strategy, and more broadly on Canada's position with respect to the Asia-Pacific region. The production of narratives on the international and regional order has even become an explicit political priority on the part of certain number of actors. We can think of China, we can think of the RAS as well, which are in fact openly aware of the need to produce narratives that are coherent, effective, and clear about their position and their contribution to the international order and to the redesign of a more stable regional order in the Indo-Pacific region, and to be able to play its part in the regional game in the Indo-Pacific and contribute to the redesign of the international and regional order in this area in particular, to a consensus that would be more stable in terms of normative positions and principles. Canada must be able to provide also a clear, convincing, and effective narrative of its foreign and defense policy. That is not the case at the moment, and this is a problem. So once again, before we can think of moving from words to actions, we need to agree on the right words and tone to adapt, beyond empty formulas, of course. So let's clarify what we are talking about, of course, and also to see the links between the definition of these principles and these objectives with practice. And so I'm going to give you a certain number of ways to think about this angle when it comes to developing an Indo-Pacific strategy. Because it's not an accident or a surprise if Canada is struggling to clarify its position when it's finding an Indo-Pacific strategy, because it is struggling to find words to articulate the vision beyond these empty formulas and taking into account its regional audience, which tends to be forgotten in this discussion. So obviously, if the words are not clear or we have not found the right words, implementation will be a problem. That's obvious. So a clear, coherent, and effective Indo-Pacific strategy must be anchored in a certain number of principles and elements of language that must then be translated into practice, obviously. So, first of all, an Indo-Pacific strategy that is clear, coherent, and effective in promoting our interests in the region will be inclusive or not. So here, I'm going to perhaps bring a dissonant voice to what some in the room responded to in favor. But we cannot exclude major players in this region from negotiations surrounding the redesign of international order because they do not share the same values or interpretation of the rules. This does not mean compromising our normative positions, but it means at least accepting the existence of divergent positions. An Indo-Pacific strategy must also recognize the centrality of the NAS in substance rather than just in the surface, and that requires a real understanding of the added value of this institution, which is certainly open to criticism. The capacities to stage and implement its ambitions are quite limited on a certain number of levels, but, sorry, I'll go from English to French acronym. The NAS conserves or retains the ability to develop the principles and rules of the multilateral game in the Indo-Pacific, and this is an absolutely crucial aspect of its contribution, and Canada cannot do without understanding the intrinsic value of the NAS. An Indo-Pacific strategy must also build on the comprehensive approach to security, as recognized in the very close links between security and development, in the way that regional actors with whom we want to strengthen ties think about their security. And so this is where the recommendation of the report that was discussed earlier contains something important. So that is Canada's ability to use its capacities, both military and non-military, and particularly diplomatically, to make a constructive and not a zero-sum game contribution to security in the region. And that includes, I think, it goes with a sustained engagement on multilateral and minilateral platforms in addition to our bilateral relations. And finally, a clear, coherent, and effective Indo-Pacific strategy must be supported by material resources that match the ambitions. And so there are obviously questions to be asked whether we should revise our ambitions for Canada's contribution to this reform of the regional order in the Asia-Pacific region, or what I'm hoping for is that we should be able to give ourselves the means to achieve our ambitions and become creative in the way we do things. But we have our ambitions, so I'm going to stop there for now. Now to Professor Massey. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be on this panel and to be able to speak after all of you on this first panel and on the second panel, defining Canada's strategic orientations. It's something that's very important for me as a co-director of the network, having formulated this team with Stephanie, because my view is quite pessimistic of the way that Canada's foreign and defense policy is perceived, and I see a policy that is wait and see, reactive, or autopilot, sometimes in which we want to maintain what we're doing in the future without asking too many questions, without needing to reflect, because we don't have an established institutionalized culture of reviewing our foreign policy, as my colleague said this morning. So this kind of meeting, this kind of discussion is fundamental. And the role that we have as academics to bridge the gap via our media presence vis-a-vis the population and our channel of transmission is also fundamental in this dialogue, I think. So in my opinion, if we want to look at Canada, the Canadian approach, it's the strategic in the field to take the theme of the panel. Canada is always in this channel on autopilot and thinking that there might be some hard choices to make. I agree with what my colleagues have said. We need to look at what is actually threatening Canada right now. Normally, Canada defines its defense policy in a concentric circle. We must defend Canada, North America, contribute to international security. We all agree that whatever government is in power, no matter who is on the table, no one is going to say we don't have to defend Canadians or North America or do our part on the international scene. What is more interesting is concretely in what area are these threats against Canadians. It's not true that there will be a Russian land invasion soon in the Arctic. It's not true. If there's a nuclear war between China and the United States, we are going to be caught up in it, but we don't have much to say in that respect. Even Canada's existence is assured and protected thanks to its ally, which is increasingly unstable, which is a real threat. What affects Canadians more concretely, I think, and I agree with my colleague, the Major General, is what we live with on a daily basis, disinformation. And there are also foreign actors who try to change the course of our elections. And we can see what that can lead to in the United States when it becomes as extreme as on January 6, 2021, rather. I don't know how you say battle of narratives or in French, but it leads Canadians to be suspicious of our institutions, to not believe the media, to not believe the governments, to not believe the political party, and to want to exclude themselves from society by getting information from YouTube influencer channels that have nothing to do with facts. And so the Canadian government can't say we're going to be the Ministry of Truth. I agree with that. However, we need to be much more transparent, which creates this distrust of our democratic institutions. It's the fact that we are served with completely empty lines of communication. Hollow formulas, I agree with you. We will continue to work together on this important issue for all Canadians. I don't know how many times I see it each day. It's really unfortunate. Or we have bilateral meetings with different ministries in the international area, and we say we're going to have a productive meeting for important issues. It doesn't mean anything to Canada or Canadians. And we need to be able to counter the narrative produced by China or Russia, and we need to be much more transparent and have this culture of risk aversion that is unfortunately infecting our departments and institutions. And I think it will lead us in the long term to have the ability to ensure the protection of Canadians and maintain this essential confidence in our democratic institutions, which in the media ensures transparency of information, and which we need to avoid a polarization into extremes in Canada, which is unfortunately already underway. If we move to the second concentric circle, so that is the defense of North America, it is also not a threat area. I think Canada has a much greater duty to monitor, project, and protect in other than monitoring. It is surprising that we lost some of our ability to see what is happening on Canadian territory and also in the Arctic for several years, and we've accepted this and have not been able to see it. And to not be able to project quickly to rescue vulnerable populations. There will be more maritime traffic in the Arctic region. We are going to have to assist because the main role in the short term is to help those who are caught rather than deter a Chinese attack in Arctic waters, I believe. And we must have this capacity to protect, which is missing. When we look at the development of Canada's military capacity, it's difficult to see what is planned, that we will be able to ensure this rapid protection of the Arctic territory while maintaining a contribution to the also in the other oceans, in the Indo-Pacific or Mediterranean or Black Sea or elsewhere in Europe. There are too few frigates, and we praise a Canadian frigate that passes through the Taiwan Strait, but it is difficult to do everything. And that's led me to the idea of wanting to make choices, because if we think that Canada can have an endogenous defense policy on the whole spectrum, I think we don't have the resources, and there's no political will, whether of the population do not invest in healthcare, not invest in the education system, so that we can have a projection for almost everywhere. And we need to identify niche areas where we can specialize in the portion and contribute to the international scene, which is very vast and which can include all choices. So we need to make them by default. That's the idea of the title. So design over default. We already do it by default. And Canada has no aircraft carriers, for example. We don't have a nuclear submarine, or we don't have armor. So these choices will be more and more difficult because we have difficulty recruiting Canadian armed forces, and it's difficult to get the necessary military equipment because it's more expensive and industries are having difficulty supplying it. And we see the consequences of the choices we've done in the past, where we don't not have an industry, for example, and the necessary armament to help the Ukrainians defend themselves at the moment against the Russians. That's a question of choices that was done upstream and over many decades, and that must be taken into consideration. So I won't take more time to go beyond to explain where I see the niches where Canada should focus on with so for the contribution on the international scene, but I will stop just at the end, at the first intervention, to talk about one. And we need to look at the capabilities. We need to provide surveillance and projection into Canadian space itself. These are the same capabilities that can be used to inform us or better communicate how we can contribute on the international scene. Of course, the future is in drones. We know it. It will be necessary, and it is already planned that we will invest in it to be able to better monitor the Arctic. Especially drones can be airborne, underwater, and of all nature. And it's this kind of capacity that should have been developed, well, not now, and which in 2026 we will have in small quantities by sampling. And these are capabilities that will be useful and were delivered in part to Ukrainians. And it's this kind of niche that we can concentrate on, where the Canadian industry can have economic benefits and development of high-tech jobs, where Canada can make a difference, and not necessarily want a land force of 200,000 men, which is capable of mobilizing several divisions in a land war in Eastern Europe. These choices are already available, and I think we need to be more explicit and think about where this added value can be useful on the international scene by focusing our attention on what is necessary to do on our own territory. Thank you very much. So we will go now to a question and answer period. There were several calls during the interventions for more conceptual clarity, but I think we need to go further, have more clarity in relation to what the threats are, because we tend to discuss them more in an abstract manner. But for people in the room or listening at home, which are not necessarily familiar with these issues, I think we need more clarity. So my question for the panel will be, what really are the main concrete multidimensional threats that Canada is facing? Who are the actors, by calling them out? Who do we need to be aware of? And maybe a question for maybe more difficult, but we need as much clarity as possible. Who are the main adversaries, challenges? So I would start with Professor Massey. Okay, I wasn't expecting to get the floor right away. So the threats. As I was saying earlier, the main threats at the moment are to social cohesion and distrust of institutions. For me, that is fundamental. It's the very essence of Canadian democracy. And if that's threatened, everything will fall apart. But if we talk more about defense policy, because it's not defense policy that will have a role to play in protecting democratic institutions, and it will be more like the National Guard that was deployed in Congress in January of 2021. And we don't want that situation in Canada, where we need Canadian armed forces. So to go back to what we were discussing on the previous panel, I think we need to look at where we can make a difference and what are our interests on the international scene. Where can we contribute? For me, the main threat in the Indo-Pacific region, to continue with this theme, and I agree with my colleagues from the previous panel, is to ensure freedom of navigation and to ensure the protection and inviolability of borders. and I think I have Taiwan in mind here, these are two fundamental Canadian interests, because all of Canada's economic prosperity depends on this freedom of navigation and on this access to these lines of maritime communication. And the instability caused by invasions or aggressions, as we can see in Ukraine, which could happen in Taiwan or other parts of the world, has effects that we now see at the grocery store every day on inflation, or that we see on regions where populations are affected. And that's where Canada can contribute slightly. Because even if we send 1 or 2 frigates every 6 months into the Taiwan Strait, that's not what will prevent the Chinese desire, for example, to set up a naval blockade around Taiwan to put pressure on its government. It won't also prevent the Chinese Liberation Army from doing this. So we don't have the ability to dissuade. I think what we can do is collaborate with its main allies to participate in this. I think it's fundamental and we can all recognize it, but it's not there to deter a conflict over Taiwan. Canada's main national interest is to contribute to this policy and to ensure that it is done with in collaboration and inclusion with the other actors in the region. So I will agree with Stéphanie on this. I will stop here. Now I will go with Professor Martel. Rather than answering the question you asked directly, I'm going to bounce off a number of points that Justin brought up. I think we can reflect on some avenues of solution, because I pretty much agree, especially with the way we defined our goals. So especially in terms of Canadian security and Canadian interests in the region, I think it's very clear what our interests are in the region. And I think that can ultimately be summed up as the preservation of a relative status quo, and towards which I think there are more actors than one might think who also have this objective in common. It is not in China's interest to disrupt freedom of navigation in Asia Pacific. And I think there's a case to be made, and we need to remind China in particular of that, and also for Canada to recognize that, in fact, if we are able to use, for example, our military capabilities, certainly, but to look at common goals or common interests in preserving a relative status quo that benefits everyone in the region. I think it's a posture that it would be better received by a range of partners in the region, including what is considered the like-minded partners. I don't have a good translation for this, but also actors with whom, let's say, our interests are more contradictory on a certain number of things. And in particular, those with whom we have conflicting values. And so in terms of solutions, I think we have a tendency to think that problems that are part of a logic of zero-sum games or traditional security in the Indo-Pacific region must lead to solutions that are also a zero-sum game, when in fact, and in particular for Canada, which has limited military capabilities and contributions to make, whereas in fact we could think differently and on another level in terms of solutions. So Canada had a very positive reputation in the 1990s for a number of different reasons and initiatives to alleviate the tensions between in the South China Sea conflicts. And Canada's contribution continues to be highlighted by our partners in the region as having been somewhat characteristic of a golden age, if we can maybe exaggerate a little bit, but for Canada's presence and contribution to the Asia-Pacific regional order. We are facing a situation that is more conflictual, that is seen as more dangerous in terms of traditional security logics. There's still room to think of solutions at a diplomatic level, at the multilateral level, which could be less in the logic of a zero-sum game, less in the logic of confrontation or response to what we see as traditional threats, but much more to play on the level of mitigating tensions. And here, really, the diplomatic game and multilateral game, although it might be associated with a fatigue or a certain skepticism, is in fact crucial. And it is crucial for our partners. There is demand for it. Whereas, in fact, there is very little appetite for many of our partners in the region who we consider to be like-minded on a certain level, even though they don't necessarily share our democratic values. I'm thinking of Singapore or Vietnam. There's very little appetite for strengthening of exclusive naval cooperation mechanisms. And there's great skepticism towards all these new mechanisms that are being developed around the quadrilateral configurations, for example, or locus, or other mechanisms like that. And we need to look at the deeper reasons why is the case, and to not put aside more established formulas that are faced with limitations, or multilateral institutions that cannot provide answers to everything all the time, or also very quickly, as concretely as one would like. But there is a fundamental importance of these mechanisms that I think Canada needs to take more seriously and be accompanied by resources to be able to reap the benefits. Thank you. I let the professors speak first to give time to the government employees to think about their answers. So I would go with Major General Smith.
The only thing I'd like to try to do is just add some perspective that I think it's wonderful that we are talking about threats that are informational and cyber, because we don't fundamentally have territorial threats here. And having served a few years in NATO, there are countries in the world, indeed, it was just talked about, that have threats. They physically are concerned. So Canada has committed to increasing its number of forces in Latvia. So if you're a country of 1.7 million people sitting next to Russia, and you just saw it take on a country of 44 million and 600,000 kilometers, you're probably a little bit nervous right now. And so those are countries that genuinely have a physical threat. So in comparison, obviously equally in the Indo-Pacific, Canada has been doing increasingly amounts to try to reinforce the rules-based international order against threats. We just had the HMCS Vancouver do a Taiwan Strait transit with a US ship as well. I agree completely. That's just one ship in a very, very big ocean, but it does continue to show us, Canada, a very capable player, doing our multilateral best and participating to reinforce the rules-based international order. And so again, it's fortunate that we can have discussions about informational concerns and cyber concerns. I've always liked to raise Poland as an example, because their population is very close to that of Canada right now, although with the number of Ukrainian refugees, it's probably quite a bit bigger right now, but about 37, 38 million people. They lost so many people in World War II to a direct attack that it took until 1970 to repopulate the country. That's a country that is genuinely very, very concerned about its physical security. And if we were getting into the academic discussion of strategic culture, it's a country that very, very, very much understands that. So no, I'd stop there and just say, I think it's wonderful that we can have these discussions that are more informational, narrative, et cetera. And I actually don't think we're that vulnerable in many ways compared to some of our allies.
Before speaking about threats, there's a challenge from our perspective, from the Canadian Armed Forces and the general government. There's a dilemma between transparency, the need to educate, to share information with the public, and more with security of operations. Because if we reveal threats too precisely, then we show our hand to how we detect threats, and there's a challenge, an internal challenge. And I would like to maybe hear you about the question, Major General, because you worked at that time period. It's a challenge that we face on a daily basis. for the from the Canadian Armed Forces standpoint. And the fact that we don't have a clear list of threats in Canada means that, as it was said by the other panelists, we don't have the same type of territorial threats as other states. And we have the backbone of the Americans to point the finger at, and we suffer the consequences more often than not. It's not well seen by the public as well. However, if we look at the announcements done by the CSE and announcements from high officials, if we think of the Chief of Public Security, if we think of also the public declarations from the different chief of states, we can identify threats. Maybe we don't have precise territorial threats, but from a continental standpoint, we do. So if I think of, for example, public declarations, we've identified that Russia is a threat to the continent. It's the main continental threat from a conventional standpoint. And also, after the conflict in Russia, there could be Russian attacks against Canada. That was talked about by the Globe and Mail and the Post. And if we talk about China, and we rarely name them, but those are the states that are worrisome, that worry us. Again, it was identified that the appetite there is appetite from China for the natural resources in the Arctic, and it's difficult to explain, but it's based on the intelligence assessment. And I think we talk a lot about signaling, but in the operations, and when people do these types of declaration, we need to consider them as important. And if we cut together the information, it becomes more and more preoccupying for us. If we talk about, for example, about fusion of cyber military by the regime, for example, we talk about the efforts of China to map the ocean ground in the Arctic. And that has implications for nuclear. And it's maybe not a threat to the Canadian Arctic, but in the balance of power and in the development of a nuclear triad. And so, yes, we don't have a clear list, but there's a way of identifying these threats, and that the information is not presented by as countries that countries have more backbone, such as the Americans, but we can talk in the public sphere about some threats. So I would give now Major General Smith the chance to answer on those points.
Wow. Yeah, so that was sort of a discussion about transparency versus operational security, or OPSEC. I think that's that therein lies the rub. That is a tremendous tension that exists within not just defense, but any national security, is how can we be as transparent as possible? I would have loved in the last election for there to have been a foreign policy debate or a defense debate. Would have been awesome. I'd love people to sit there and go, we need more, we need less. Didn't happen. And I blame you. It's not my fault. I'm apolitical, but it's your fault because you didn't force it to happen. So it's the Canadian population. And again, back to that misty academic term of strategic culture. It's just not, the average Canadian doesn't feel terribly threatened. Not about cyber, not about information, not about physical security. And so there's nobody pounding on the doors that I'm aware of over not far from here at Pierce, where I work, going, we want to know more. Now, there are some different groups, etc., that are part of being read in on things, but I guess that's enough because nobody's asked for more. And if you want more, you'll have to make it actually something that that your politicians want to know. That's who I work for, is the legitimately elected politicians. And so there will continue to be the challenge of, we need to be special operations forces, intelligence, everything. There's certain things that just, it's not useful because it will be known that certain techniques are out there, and that'll make us more vulnerable. But how at the same time do we actually expose as much as possible? Because quite frankly, if you went into some of the offices over at National Defense Headquarters, I think you'd find there's nothing that dark and mysterious happening in there. I work at a desk, I've got a computer. There's no ninjas running around doing backflips. I'm sorry, it's not happening there. And I would genuinely be very interested in showing many of you the awesome work that's going on, and that's a headquarters, so who cares? But in the different bases around the world and in Canada, it's fantastic. And I think it's a natural tension. We have a natural suspicion of things that are secret, you're hiding something, or it's just operational security. We have to be careful what we expose, but I wish it was actually a greater debate, actually.
Thank you very much. In the interventions that I've heard, there seems to be two suggestions I would summarize into one to face threats. So we talk about education, to have the analogy of sex talk. When we talk about education, there's education, and the second approach would be transparency and clarity, because I would put the two together because it's both part of the same whole. So those are the two approaches. With the education committee, my question would be, what could it look like realistically? Because if we talk about integrating notions of cybersecurity, of hygiene in the curriculum, we fall into the environment, the pleasant environment of governmental issues, because it brings actors that are not part of these conversations at all that become necessary. So that means the provinces. So if we really want to concentrate on the education of people, is it realistic to say that we could have a national strategy on that level? And with transparency and clarity, we talked about the issue between operations and transparency. And then there's also the fact that there's a big opacity culture in the Canadian government. And when we look at a strategy of transparency that is intergovernmental, there are many issues in both approaches. But what I was wondering, what I would ask the panelists, that what could it look like realistically? What could we accomplish in the next couple of years? It's a very big question. I would go with Professor Martel first. So I do not want to talk about the issues that are intergovernmental, because that is not my domain of expertise. But by hearing the question, I think that the education as we see it traditionally in universities or in the public sphere has a role to play in the way that we can develop our resiliency based on these questions of information and disinformation. And we need to go further. Would it allow us to avoid potential difficulties? I'm not certain about that. And we can take example on a certain amount of Indo-Pacific countries. And those countries have communities, I'm trying to find the translation, of practitioners of society that are anchored in society. They want to favorize dialogue between the communities. And we can talk about peace builders in English, or peacemakers. And I believe that civil society in Canada has many of these actors who have a role to play in education, in brackets, and who are not integrated into a system of education that is provincial. And so I think we need to develop the abilities of these actors to do their work with an anchoring in the community, with an open-mindedness, and the resources. How should I say it? Concrete resources or concrete links to be able to establish projects, common projects that reinforce tolerance and the ability of people to speak to each other, and despite their differences. All the while working on education, as was mentioned. I think that is really what we need to think about when we think about a project that's bigger than us. I would go to the other end of the table. I think before developing a national education strategy that develops provincial programs, I think we need to start more in a limited manner. We need education in the federal government, and we need to identify the threats, because it's a community that is very closed and exclusive because of the question of operational security, classification, etc. And as I said earlier, we need to democratize the analysis that is done. So it's not necessarily, it's what are the implications, and the fact that the agencies or people who have a role to play in sectors that could be targeted by threats that are not necessarily military, but it could be economic threats or spying, espionage, they need to have the information to make decisions that are adequate. I think the CSC is playing a very important role in the engagement with the commercial sector or private sector with the type of threats that they could face. I know it's these types of initiatives that could be put into place by other agencies. We don't talk very much about the role of Heritage Canada in the promotion of communications, of Canadian culture that could play a much more important role in the information sector. So that's thinking outside of the box. So how do we develop a holistic approach to touch upon these subjects? And I like the work that's done by public affairs on social media through the creation, whether it be Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. We put forward an approach, a new approach for the Canadian Armed Forces that is very realistic, according to, in my opinion, where the Marines are very active on Twitter to promote their activities and the type of engagement that they do. And that's the way to join the population in a perspective of recruiting and give them a perspective into the Canadian Armed Forces in the world that doesn't go through media, traditional media, or official declarations, but which allows Canadians to have a better understanding of the issues that they're faced with right now. Dr. Massy, so I think it's also about education. What I know is 40 research chairs in Quebec, in Canada, is not maybe the best solution to understand the issues. I've had the experience, and I will talk about my personal experience. I've done a lot of media since February, and one that affected me was the initiative that wants to vulgarize war in Ukraine. I had to talk with teachers about how to formulate this thing that they see on TV without necessarily understanding the causes of war, which revenge and imperialism. I think this initiative would allow us to inform the new generation better, and also to give them another point of view. So there are two important actors in that. The first one is the politicians, who should consider Canadians as more intelligent people, so to speak clearly, directly, and without being scared of the electoral costs. I think Canadians are able to take it, and if they could get more, they want more. and it will be a bit ecocentric, but we need to talk about the universities. What I said, for example, with the youth in elementary schools, Radio Canada and Radio X will talk to university students to know what's going on, because they won't go to Radio X and explain that the Canadian position on the nuclear threats is going on. They'll talk to university students, and we need to create this interaction with university students. I love the Binds network, which talks about strategic data, but we need to go further in models like Nexem in France or in the USA, where we can create this interaction with the government. We've had a difficulty in implementing it in Canada. So university students that can work in the government and government employees that can work in think tanks, I think it could have very concrete data to better understand both sides and have this transmission channel between the government and the general population. Thank you. Major General Smith, thank you. I could continue to express myself in English, in French, but at least you'll understand me better. So
I'm really happy with my analogy that about sex education. I've decided I'm very happy with that analogy now, so I'll keep going with it. Of course, education is a provincial responsibility. And probably some of you seen, again, going back to the sexual education thing, there was active debate sometimes. What should be part of the sexual education? LGBTQ, is that appropriate in sex education? Those debates will occur, and that's wonderful. And they'll come to what is the right form of education in that. And I think the same thing will undoubtedly happen from an informational perspective to say, well, what do we have to tell our children about what to be safe with in information? Because certain aspects of it, well, you're just looking at right wing, left wing. Well, there'll be a debate will occur, and each province territory will decide how that works. But equally, I would say a little bit larger, because I like some of the comments at the table. To be Canadian is to feel inadequate. At least that's my personal feeling, having lived about 6 years outside of the country. I think at different times, we enjoy kicking the crap out of ourselves and how inadequate we are. And yet, I think we are a security provider. We're not a security absorber. So everything I just said about cyber and informational protection, we do tremendously well at that. Our democracy, I think, is tremendously stable. Our nationalities problems are well resolved, pretty well resolved. I've been in places where they're very, very certainly not. And so I think we're a security provider. I think we can go out across the world and help provide some of the information about how do you function like this within a democracy? How do you manage information? What are these things that happen from a cyber perspective? How do you protect yourselves against that? We do some of these institutional things tremendously well in Canada. And of course, I'm a military person up here, but prisons, judicial systems, there's this taxing. Those are tremendously boring. I hope I'm not offending anybody, but they're tremendously important institutionally. And we do them very, very well in Canada. And I think we should provide that internationally. So when you think about what can Canada do to go out into the world and help provide security, I think those are just other elements. And so is this. Thank you.
Thank you. Since we're quite short on time, I would like to go to questions from the public. If there's any question in the room, I see one hand up. And I would invite panelists to be brief in their answers in the interest of everyone having the occasion to answer.
I don't know if it's on. Yeah. It is? Okay. Hello, my name is Anvesh Jain. I'm a law student at the University of Ottawa and an emerging scholar with the also Analyst strategic. This question is more directed to Major General Smith. So you kind of talked about inoculating people in the home front, and kind of we all have a responsibility as folks who have been in this field for a bit longer, who have an awareness of how this all ties into the larger strategic picture of, and you kind of, had the analogy of the sex talk, parents to kids, but oftentimes as somebody from an immigrant community, I noticed that it's the other way around, where it's the parents who are getting disinformation either from the home country or through WhatsApp or through different circles. And then I'm kind of, my mom will be like, oh, have you heard this on the news? And I'm like, Mom, It's not true. Like, think about it. And she's like, well, what do you know? You're a kid. So one is kind of how to structure that conversation where it's not necessarily the kids know better, but have access to a different variety of sources or are able to inoculate themselves better. And then second, how do you have these conversations with your peers without coming across as a little conspiratorial? Often I have friends who send me TikToks and stuff, and I always say, you know, TikTok's a national security threat. And they say, oh, Anvesh, don't be silly. So how do you kind of structure those conversations? I know we have a responsibility, but sometimes it's difficult to make that communication happen.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully there's some smarter people up here that can help with this, but so there's adult education as well, of course. And so we're focused on educating children and we're inoculating them against cyber and informational threats. And very clearly, like I'm third generation Canadian on one side and I don't know, eighth on the other side. So I don't understand the immigrant community particularly, but I would go back to there is a form of education and there's certain prerequisites to become a Canadian citizen. Perhaps this becomes part of it, to say you're going to be exposed to things. And I'll go back to my earlier point about what is information. We get stuff here in Canada that we're used to consuming. There's an entire, whatever the proper term is, universe of information out there in news. And all we can do is, like I said, I think there's education for children, but there's adult education. And perhaps it's part of what we educate new Canadians to become. It's difficult. I think it's difficult to go to a new country and learn. I had to move into Belgium and it was a fascinating experience. Took a while, and it takes a while for new Canadians to do the same. And sorry, your second question? Oh, this conspiracy. Wow. So I've got people on Facebook that I choose not to respond to. So like, let's go with the current one, COVID. I've got people in my family I've seen very little because they think they will die if they go outside. And I equally have people that have, no, this never happened. And so I think I ignore some of them because I've had my own education on that as well. I guess you have to choose. Now we're sitting here right now, very close to where the trucking protest happened. As a citizen that went back home every night, I walked by it. Didn't choose to embrace it. All I would say is we're all educated and you can choose to help educate your peers and friends or equally not.
Thank you. Any other person wants to take that one?
I could step in. My mic works, yes. To just that later question, and I think those are excellent questions, by the way, so thank you for raising them. They're really kind of, helping me reflect as well. And as I was seeking to reflect on that second question, something that came to me, and perhaps this is the closest I'll ever come to providing policy recommendations to provinces, and on that education terrain, like this rarely happens. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. But I do think it's really a matter of reinforcing the critical skills of the Canadian public, right? And I think we should be very concerned about a tendency to see education only through the lens of marketable skills, and also in terms of having the government having, positions on what fields have to be reinforced, particularly because they meet these kind of marketable, skill concerns, because this translates into an attack on the social sciences, which are exactly the fields that most of us are working within, and are the fields where we have this capacity to build the critical thinking skills of the Canadian public. And that's, across levels, not just at a university, but beyond, and in the way that we engage also in, knowledge translation and diffusion, which I think, that you provided a great example of. So I think we need to be very wary of a tendency, and we're hopefully there's a reckoning that this is actually leading to some pretty dramatic issues that we need to deal with through the prism of national security even, right? So hopefully this is something that comes across, although I don't think that many of our provincial governments in the country right now are actually realizing that and the link between them. And this is a huge, huge problem.
No one else on that question. In that case, we still have a few minutes. So I would go to a question from online if there is any. No, there isn't any. Or from the public. A follow-up. Oh, no, there's another question from someone else.
Hi, my name is Rishi. I'm currently working here in Canada, in Ottawa, and I've studied University of Alberta for a Bachelor of Commerce degree. And I kind of enjoy this conference, but for the most part, but there are some ideas that I do not totally comprehend. So for example, as I think the general mentioned that Canada is more of a security provider than a security like a spoiler sort of thing. But it's kind of difficult for me to understand. There's like a situation somewhere safe in between like Indo-Pacific area, which has been like peaceful for past decades, something like tens of years, but due to some external factors, which the sides of like some Western allies, like the US, considered it's a threatening factor. So they took action that they consider as peacekeeping, but which actually de facto intensify some of the pressure like in a different region. So that creates causes a series of consequences that was not on the track of your US allies thinking mode. So I was just curious, like how do you promoting the idea of your security concept to like a different region, because people might have different interests to safeguard, and the fact that it's security doesn't mean that it has like it's temporarily secure, doesn't mean that it will be in a situation that will similar to what you consider as secure. And some of your action that you took here as from a good perspective, good purpose, might actually causes some turbulence from the other regions. So how do you actually comprehend this situation or explain it to people here and people like in a different country? Like they totally think it's just like, okay, we are not one who start this issue, but I don't know why are you guys doing this? So we're going to do something well as things as well. So how do you solve those situations?
No, thank you very much for the question. The way I'd express it, and again, I'm being careful to say I'm not telling you what we should be doing, but rather this is how Canada's reacting is when I say Canada is a provider of security, we intend to back up the rules-based international order. And so indeed, I had a discussion in another country a few months ago in which we talked about the Ukraine. And I said, just to be clear, from an economic perspective, the invasion of Ukraine and what it's done to economies is actually in many ways very good for Canada. We sell a lot of the same stuff that Ukraine and Russia, be it oil or grain or et cetera, but equally, let there be no doubt, this is unacceptable from a Canadian perspective because big countries don't get to attack small countries. I'm not going to get to the Melian dialogue here, but that the rules-based international order forbids that. And so I'd say when I talk about providing security, and the Indo-Pacific's a great example of that right now, is that there is international waters, UNCLOS, et cetera. And we're there to reinforce that with our allies to say, this is based on how the world works right now. This is providing international security based on the rules-based international order. And we have allies that want to do that with us, whether it's in Europe or it's in the Indo-Pacific right now. And so that's sort of the framework I look at this from, is that Canada is a provider of security based on the existing rules-based international order. Thank you.
Does anyone want to take 30 seconds to also answer?
I can go ahead. I think a really, interesting elements that you raised have to do with the fact that sometimes we're being very tone deaf in the way that we present ourselves as security providers in other regions. And we need to kind of have a better sense of what the regional context and perspectives are on how we approach security. And I'm going to draw from an example that I know a little bit about, which is Canada's involvement in the promotion of a women, peace and security agenda, including in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think this is where we're becoming aware that sometimes there is kind of an anti-colonial reflex, kind of knee-jerk reaction to anything that's associated or that comes to be associated with the promotion of a narrow liberal agenda. That's being seen sometimes by our partners, despite the fact that they're interested in very similar things that have to do with the interaction between gender and security. And a lot of countries are already working, to kind of assess these interconnections. It's just that the tone or the manner by which we promote certain norms and tends to sometimes elicit reactions that are kind of, part of this kind of anti-colonial or foreign influence or anti-Western influence when it comes to promoting certain norms. But we have to figure out what is actually the problem and the source of this resistance better. And sometimes it has much less to do with the substance of what we're pushing for and much more with the manner and tone we adopt.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais remercier tous nos panélistes pour cet exemple.